To our discussion and lecture on The Great Gatsby, Chapter 5. We like to call this the reunited chapter because this is when Gatsby, after 5 long years, is able to again set eyes on Daisy. However, he doesn't do it in the traditional sense. So we also like to call this, "Could you set me up, bro?" Because he sort of asks Nick to be a little bit covert with this whole meeting with Daisy, and he has Nick invite Daisy over, unbeknownst to her that Gatsby's also going to be there. It's a little like a high school say, "Hey, I like this girl. Could you invite her over to your house? And then I'll just happen to show up," sort of thing. And that's exactly how it plays out. But there are some interesting situations that occur in that process. So, after 5 long years, Gatsby sends over a lot of flowers, doesn't he? We find that Gatsby sort of is an over the top guy, and he sent over all of these flowers, almost more than Nick can even fit in his little cottage. He's had the grass mown. He's done all of these things very much like his over the top parties. And we found out, of course, that he's doing this because he is trying to attract, as they said in the previous chapter, moths to a light or to a flame. And in this case, the moth is Daisy, and he wants to attract her to him. And so he's waiting for it. He's been waiting a long time, and he continues to wait. They think she's going to be there any minute, and then all of a sudden, before she even gets there, he shows and reveals his insecurities, and he says, "I can't wait all day," which is kind of funny because he has waited, and he's been waiting for 5 years for this. And Nick sort of says to him, "Hey, it's not even time for her to be here yet. Calm down." So he does kind of suck it up a little bit, and then later, when he does show up and Daisy is there, he doesn't know what to do. He shows his insecurities again, and he says, or Nick says to him, "You're acting like a little boy. You're being a child. You're being childish. Go in there and talk to her. You've put this all together. She's in there. Don't be rude." And so he does go in there. Both of those quotes are in the hardcover book on page 90 and 93. So as we move forward, we'd like to look at some symbolism with regards to this chapter, and especially with regards to this first kind of initial meeting between Daisy and Gatsby. So we're going to start with a question. Now, every time you see a question in here, it will be in green, and the video will stop for a moment after I get done reading it, and you will have the opportunity, if you are doing this assignment on Hudson High School, to answer the question. And the video will stop. You have to respond in some way before the video will start again. So let's start with the first question, and it is in relation to symbolism. Gatsby has dressed himself to impress. He's done everything to impress everyone else so that Daisy will eventually be his most important subject to impress. So keep in mind that he is all about maintaining this wealthy appearance. He wants to look rich. Okay. So the question is, what is he wearing when he's finally reunited with Daisy? Indicate those 3 main colors Gatsby is wearing and what those 3 main colors might symbolize. So there are 3 colors you're looking for, and also the 3 colors, they can collectively symbolize one thing. I'll give you that hint. Okay. So the video will stop and you will answer the question. All right, I hope that went well. We're going to talk about another piece of symbolism here. And the question will lead into it by saying it's more than just rain. Weather always means something, whether it's rain or snow or a hurricane or hail or whatever. And so I want you to notice the changes in weather in this chapter. And it mainly has to do with when it rains and when it doesn't rain, okay? What might the rain symbolize? Consider when it rains or when it doesn't, and what deeper significance the rain might give to what is happening in the chapter. Consider what water does. Consider what rain can produce. And so what is happening here, do you think, with regards to Daisy and Gatsby's lives and what Gatsby would like to happen as it relates to rain? And remember when it does rain and what's happening at those times. Okay, the video will stop at this point and you will answer the question. Okay, next, last question for this screen. We have something to do with time, and also not rocket science. Whenever there's a clock or a watch or whatever, some kind of a timepiece, the author is usually trying to say something about time. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming screen. But right now, I would like to attract your attention to page 91 in the hardcover book. And by the way, if you haven't taken your book out already, will you please do that? It's going to be so much easier for you, even if these page numbers don't line up, to have your book available so that you can page through it and find some things when I ask you to look for, when we ask you to look for things. All right, so here's the quote. The quote is, "The clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place." Now, this is happening when Gatsby first walks into the room and he's trying to be really cool and calm and collected, and he's not. He's very clumsy, he's very awkward. And but I think what's interesting about this quote and what I want you to look at the clock for is you look at how the diction shows the word dangerously and pressure and head, and he caught it with trembling fingers. So you can imagine what's going on in Gatsby's head, actually, that there's some element of danger there because he is obviously trying to reunite with a married woman. So there's some concern there. And we look at the word pressure and the fact, the pressure of his head. There's a lot of pressure in Gatsby's head, as it turns out, because he has been thinking about this moment and planning this moment and dreaming about this moment, working towards this moment for over 5 years. And so there's a lot of pressure on him. He's probably putting a lot of pressure on Daisy. So that's a really good choice of words. And then the trembling fingers. And you know, when you tremble, you're afraid or you're scared or you're nervous. And so those are all of the things that we can consider. So in that whole situation, what might the clock symbolize? And I would like for you to answer that question. Okay, speaking of rain and clocks and Gatsby, hopefully you've had some time to think about and answer some questions. So we're going to have just a little discussion about some specific quotes here. Um, we'd like to ask what's going on with Gatsby? Has he lost his mojo? I mean, he might be dressed to impress and he might have been able to pull off this kind of appearance over the course of the last 5 years and building up his fortune, but he's far from that confident, mysterious millionaire when he shows up at Nick's cottage. In fact, when he comes in and he makes his entrance, because Daisy shows up and Nick turns around and Gatsby's gone. And he's like, where did he go? And he ran around the back to come in the front door so that he could make his appearance. Unfortunately, when Nick opens the door, that ta-da moment is sort of deflated because he's standing there in the rain looking like a wet puppy. So he's not looking real cool right now. And he's looking, in fact, terrified, as we see in this quote. It says, "Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes." Now, look at those colored words there. We look at the word weights, and I think it's really interesting. It's a fun play on words for me because he's waited for 5 years to do this, but there's a weight on his shoulders and a weight on his heart because this is a pretty scary moment for him. And he's worried, what is Daisy going to think of me? Is she going to be impressed? Am I going to make an impression? And he's standing in a puddle of water. And you think back to what you talked about with water before. And it says he's glaring tragically into my eyes. And so, when something's tragic, I mean, you're thinking, oh, this is terrible. This is awful. And that's actually not what they're supposed to be doing there. They're supposed to be having a good visit with each other and catching up after all of these years. And notice also the word eyes. So there's Gatsby standing like a wet puppy, scared to death, not knowing what to do, goes and hides. And Nick calls him a little boy and says, go out there and be a man. And he does. But when he does, it's still fairly awkward at the beginning. And we see that with this quote on page 91 also of the hardcover book. It says he's leaning, this is the part where he's leaning against the mantelpiece, and when the clock falls or starts to fall, it says Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease. Now look at that phrase, strained, meaning, it's a strain. He's forcing it. Counterfeit is fake of perfect ease. So he's pretending to be relaxed, even bored, it says here, but he's not. And it reminds me of that point in time when he's getting ready to go into town with Nick, and he's kind of doing that same thing where he's leaning against the car and he thinks he looks real relaxed, but Nick sees the strain even in that he's working very, very hard to put up this facade, this appearance. And then it says his head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock. And from this position, his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair. Notice how the word defunct is there, the clock. And you talked before, hopefully, about what you think that clock symbolizes. So I'm going to bring you back to that and what you wrote. And hopefully it had something to do with the fact that time has, Gatsby's wanting time to stop. He's wanting to control time, but he's not able to, probably. And so there's a little foreshadowing there. And it says defunct means it doesn't work. So the other thing I want you to look at is his distraught eyes. When you're distraught, you're terribly upset and worried and concerned. So what's he so worried about and concerned about when he stares with those distraught eyes down at Daisy? And lastly, I want you to compare the difference between the two of them, because obviously they're both kind of equally scared and nervous, as Nick pointed out to Gatsby earlier. But it says she is frightened but graceful. So it shows that Daisy really has a much better way of maintaining her composure in situations like this. She's more trained. She's been brought up this way, whereas Gatsby, it has a much more difficult time sort of hiding his distractions and his concerns. Okay, so they have this great discussion. They finally kind of come out of their shells. Nick goes outside, leaves them alone, stands underneath a tree while it's raining. There's that rain again. Well, when he comes back in, Daisy and Gatsby have kind of caught up a little bit. They're a little bit more comfortable with each other, to the point where Gatsby, of course, wants Daisy to go over and see his house. And I mean, obviously, that's what this whole meeting was about, to show off how far Gatsby had come and how successful he was. So he he basically says, hey, look, there's my house. And it's this kind of ginormous, grotesque castle, that doesn't really belong in the location that it is. But there it is, kind of an over-the-top, ostentatious sort of building. And he says, and Daisy is so impressed, right? She's like, oh my, do you live there? Oh, I would like to go over there. And so they plan to, and they invite Nick along. So the question is, why? It reminds me of the time when Nick was with Myrtle and Tom, and they go to Myrtle and Tom's apartment, and Nick knows very well what that apartment is for. And they say, hey, come on up, let's have a little party. And Nick's like, I don't think so. And now the same thing happens. Gatsby and Daisy say, hey, come with us. Nick says, I don't think so. But he goes anyway, even though it's just so awkward, right? So the video is going to stop for a moment, and I want you to talk about why they might want Nick to come along. There could be several answers there, and speculate a little bit, have some fun with thinking about why they would want Nick with them. All right, next we're going to talk about when they actually show up at Gatsby's. They get over to Gatsby's place, and Gatsby's showing them around. He's introducing her to the guy who's sort of hanging on, living in his apartment or his house for a while because he's rich and he can. Clip Springer. And the whole time, Gatsby is looking at Daisy, thinking, WWDT, what will Daisy think, right? I know, lame, but, and here's this quote from pages 96 and 97. It says, he hadn't once ceased, or he hadn't once stopped looking at Daisy. And I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. So, of course, there's those eyes again, but he's seeing everything that he's done. He's seeing all of his purchases, those books in the library, everything he has amassed through her eyes. Does she approve? Will she approve? Is this going to be enough for her? Okay. And there's, oh, here they come. There's those eyes. Aren't they beautiful? Those are those well-loved eyes. Speaking of Daisy and her well-loved eyes, she sees something when she's at Gatsby's house that makes her cry. Why is Daisy crying? Here's another question for you. The video will stop and you will answer at the end of chapter 5. As they're walking around the house, Nick is still there, and they go up to, kind of in an awkward way, they go up to Gatsby's enormous bedroom, and he's kind of showing off his space, and he does something that makes her cry. What is it? And Why is she really crying? Answer that question in a few seconds here. Okay. I'd like to spend, again, some time looking at some quotes, and a little bit later you'll be able to find some quotes for yourself as well. We want to look and see what's going on here with these two passages. So after Gatsby has shown Daisy around, he's made her cry, and all of these kinds of things, there's several quotes here. One's on page 98 and one's on page 101 of the hardcover book. So we're going to look at both of them and consider both of them together, paying attention to those words that are in green. It says the first quote is, possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that green light had now vanished forever. The colossal significance. Colossal means massive, ginormous, right? And significance is meaning, or importance. So that green light had this just major, massive importance to him, and now that had vanished forever. That green light he was reaching for at the beginning of the chapter, or chapter 1. And then it continues, compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now, we know that stars and moons aren't real close to each other, but when we look at them up in the sky from far, far away, our vantage point makes it appear that they're close together. Now it was again a green light, it says, on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. Those enchanted objects, those dream objects, what that light represented, and it said had diminished. It had reduced itself by one. So that green light, he's no longer going to reach and tremble towards that green light because he has Daisy here with him. So now, how does he feel about that? Was it everything he hoped and dreamed it would be? The next quote, as I went over to say goodbye, this is Nick talking, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Now, that's really interesting because he has everything he wants. There she is. She's with him. She's impressed. She's happy. She's beautiful, but he's puzzled. He's bewildered, and he has some doubts, right? It's almost like a pinch me moment. Like, is this really happening? And it says there must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. Whoa, tumbled short of his dreams? She was everything he dreamed that she was supposed to be, but yet now that she's here, and I want to redirect your attention to that pre-reading question that you guys wrote about for chapter 5, we asked you to consider something that you had really hoped and dreamed and planned to have or do, and then when you finally got it, how did you feel? Was it everything you dreamed it would be, or did you have some experience of letdown? And that's kind of what we're talking about here with Gatsby, and through no fault of her own, it says, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal, there's that word again, vitality of his illusion. So it's not her fault if she doesn't match up to his dream of her. So consider how things might be moving forward. Is she going to be everything he cooked up in his head for 5 years? It says no amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. And ghosts, of course, are the spirits of the past. And in many ways, Daisy is a spirit of his past until he tries to revive that Daisy in that relationship with him that he had so many years ago. So this is an interesting thing to stop and consider. Is she really going to be everything he needs her to be? And is it her fault if she's not? Consider that. All right, almost to the last screen. I do have a question for you. We have a question for you on color. And I know in your charts that you created for chapters 2 and 3, we did some comparing, and we asked you about color. So I'd like to have you guys look at colors again. We'd like you to look at colors that you didn't do on your chart and colors that we didn't talk about in this PowerPoint or this movie. And we would like for you to choose a color from the novel anywhere between chapters 1 and 5 and see if you can, first of all, list the color. Is it green? Is it blue, yellow, red, white, whatever it is, and indicate 2 ways that color is symbolic. We talked about the symbols of some colors in your chart. We talked about symbols earlier in this PowerPoint. So we want you to choose a different color this time and say, here's the color green. And here are two ways that it is used in the novel in a symbolic way. Green represents A here, green represents B here. And maybe they could even be the same representation, but in two different places, okay? So the video is going to stop and you're going to have a chance to respond to this question. And finally, it's your turn. We have been spending so much time looking over some quotes and reading passages and thinking about them and talking about them that we would like for you to have a turn as well. So your question is relating to finding a quote and discussing it. When the video stops, you will have the opportunity to choose. This is why you need your book. Choose and write down a passage from chapter 5 that grabbed your attention. It has to be something we haven't used here in this presentation, but there are plenty of great pieces and sentences and passages for you to find. So first of all, find something that was interesting to you. It was maybe the wording was interesting, the imagery was interesting, the way the characters spoke were interesting, something that was interesting. Write down that passage from chapter 5 that grabbed your attention, and then include the page number. After you do that, quote page number, we want you to respond. Why did you choose that passage? And what might it have to do with some of the elements of fiction? So why you chose it, and then over here, you can see A, B, and C, and choose one of those, not all of them, but one of them to focus on for the quote or the passage that you found. Letter A says, what does your passage reveal about one of the characters? B is, how does your passage add to the plot? And C is, how might your passage foreshadow what might happen next? So spend a little bit of time kind of having fun, digging through the book, finding some quotes and some passages that are interesting to you. Write them down, write down the page number, and kind of talk to us about why, what they did for you and how they are affecting the novel character or plot or foreshadowing at this point. And at this point, we're going to end the presentation. I hope that it was interesting and informative, and keep reading, folks. Take care.